Great. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody, from wherever you are watching or listening to us, or wherever you're joining this series. My name is Divine Fu. I am the director of HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town here in South Africa, where it is 7 past 6. It's a beautiful day. It's the last week of activities here at HUMA. So we're excited about this particular discussion today. The Ethical Humanitarianism series has run throughout the year. It's a collaboration between HUMA and Kweku. I'll allow my colleague Kweku to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Kweku Ahitsa. I'm the director for the Freedom Institute for Evaluation. So it's a research and consulting institute. We are located in Friedensau on the campus of Friedensau Adventist University here in Germany. And we offer project technical support for project planning, monitoring, and evaluation. And we also conduct evaluation feasibility studies for humanitarian and development organizations. And we also do pure academic research and research collaborations. And we are partnering with HUMA for this ethical humanitarian series. It's a long journey up to now, and we are very excited to continue the discussion this evening, because of all the different groups and wonderful people that has made it possible up to this point. So we look forward to the interaction. Yeah, I will let Divine continue the introduction.
Thank you, Kweku. Thank you, Kweku. It's been a very long journey, a long year, and really jam-packed. We thank colleagues at HUMA, and also many of the speakers who have spoken. We had a board meeting a few hours ago, and we were just evaluating how amazing it's been to bring people within the context of all border closures, and to have more than 150 people interact from across the world and different parts of the continent in different spaces. It's just shown how it's possible, despite all of the political economy of borders that currently shape the world. But HUMA is the Institute for Humanities in Africa. The University of Cape Town is an interdisciplinary research space. And we like to say that we are a Pan-African institute with an Afropolitan vision, and that we are grounded deeply in the humanities, not as a monolithic place, but a humanity as kind of an interdisciplinary space that engages, many other disciplines. So anybody who deploys the humanity and who wants to engage the humanity as a tool, we do research, run lots of projects, but also training the next generation of scholars is really important for us, and also public engagement. This particular series, Ethical Humanitarianisms, were created out of this context of conflicts and tensions, and also questions around dignity, asking questions about sustainability and the future of the continent, and the health crisis that shaped the world, at the beginning of 2020. And we thought it was important to ask questions that would interrogate the ontological and epistemological assumptions that underpin the different imaginaries about humanitarianisms, and just try to ask what it will mean and take to reimagine this, to decolonize this, to frame this within a feminist framework, and just how to account for philanthropy as acts of kindness, different kinds of intervention, the struggles on the continent that are also not usually included in formal humanitarian projects that are often conceived, as either formal intervention. And we've asked many questions throughout the year. For example, what is financing? What is international development? What is philanthropy? What is humanitarian work looks like? These are all important questions. And today, we have a group of what we are calling a very high level panel, because this is the end. This is the end of the series, what we're calling the grand finale. We have 6 speakers who are going to speak to us and coming from different parts and different organizations. I'm going to introduce them briefly. We're going to start with Tamara Enomoto, who is a professor at the Organizations for Strategic Coordination of Research and Intellectual Properties in the Meiji University in Japan. Thank you, Tamara, for waking up so early at 1 a.m. in Japan, for being here. And we are sorry to push you to be here. Tamara is also on the HUMA board, so it's good to have you. And then we have Euclides Gonçalves, who is director of Kaleidoscopio in Mozambique, which is also a leading research and also community development, international development, and also innovation center on the continent. And they do work in intersection between policy and research, also and community development. So thank you, Euclides. I know you're very busy. Euclides is on our board. Then we have Sheila Gastro, who is advisor at Gastro Consulting here in South Africa. Sheila, I think your camera we cannot see you, but hopefully we can turn on your camera. Yes, there's Sheila. So great to see you. Sheila is actually a consultant, both in higher education and also in consulting, in development work, in also building organizations, and also in financing and funding, and also has been key to pushing some of the projects, you know, at HUMA. So thank you for being here, Sheila. And then we have Ornella Moderan, who has just arrived in Niger this morning and has had a very long day. Thank you, Ornella, for making it here. And we're sorry that we're adding up onto your day. But Ornella is head of the Sahel program at the Institute for Security Studies she's also based here in many parts of the continent, but she's head of the region there in the Sahel studies in Mali. And then we have Emmanuel. Emmanuel is not yet here. I think he is still struggling to join, but Emmanuel is on our board, Emmanuel is a program coordinator and consultant for education and skills development at the African Development Bank, and he is based in Cote d'Ivoire. And last but not least is Lisa Ramon. Lisa Roman is a senior research advisor of the Unit for Research Cooperation at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency in Sweden, which is well known to many as SIDA. And it's really great to have you all here. So I am going to pass on to Kweku, and Kweku will begin the discussions. As we said, we will try to organize it around a set of questions that will allow you to do your talks and presentations. And then we'll go through 2 or 3 sets of questions, but will allow you to make your presentations around those. Then we'll move to a question and answer session. Emmanuel has just joined us, Kweku. Let me just, Emmanuel, welcome. I was just introducing colleagues. If you turn on your camera, we will be able to have you. I know you just logged on, but I've introduced you already, Emmanuel. So I think we'll bring you on as we start. So, Kweku.
Okay.
How about you?
Yeah, thank you, Divine, for the wonderful introduction to the whole ethical humanitarianism series. And today, as you mentioned it, the grand finale. Usually grand finales, there is always an extra time and penalties and all that, especially in football. But I hope we will not go beyond the time with penalties and extra time and all that. Yeah. So we have gone through this year looking at these two broad concepts. And we've discussed several questions here. And this evening, we are trying to commonize or bring everything together by reimagining what ethical humanitarianism is all about. So let's start with this question. As we've heard, all the wonderful works you are doing in all over the world and all the different parts and touching different lives as well. We will start the discussion by trying to conceptualize what, ethical humanitarianism is all about. What is it? We have specific works, we have different engagements. How do you, and by you, I mean each of you, the speakers, how do you conceptualize, how do you work with these concepts in your everyday activities, in our everyday work? As we start on that, especially from your experience and all the other kind of cutting edges or edges that you work with. We will start according to the list that we have, and therefore we have 10 minutes for each speaker to address some of these questions that will come. And of course, we want to make it very interactive. So if you have an input or you want to add something to what a speaker had already said, please feel free to join. And we are starting with Tamara. And Tamara, so you have to go first and give us what your own conceptualization about ethical humanitarianism is for our audience. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me use my PowerPoint. Okay. And thank you, Chair, and thank you, Divine. And thanks to my humor colleagues for your kind invitation to speak today. And yeah, it's so divine. Thank you. And these are actually the main questions from the organizer that I received yesterday, and I will try to address some of them, the other ones. What is your specific working and experience with humanitarianism, and what kind of strategic cutting-edge interventions are you doing, etc. And most critical challenges or critical questions to ask. These questions I will try to answer. And I'm professor at Major University, and I used to work for 12 years at Oxfam, a very famously humanitarian organization, and at the same time, quite infamously racist Western-centric organization. So I will talk based on my experience as well as based on my own research. And as you know very well, as the Black Lives Matter movement brought to the fore the systemic, structural, and widespread nation of racism, a logical conclusion was that the development and humanitarian sector may not have been immune to racism. So currently there is as you know, a growing call for the sector to tackle the impacts of racism, white supremacy, colonialism, inequality, gender prejudice, and patriarchy, all of which are deeply embedded in our sector's power structures. But it seems to me that this kind of debate has not quite taken root in a small sector of the humanitarian development industry, which is called humanitarian disarmament sector, which encompasses arms transfer control, landmine prohibition, cluster munitions prohibitions, arms control, etc. But it doesn't mean that this humanitarian disarmament sector is immune to racism. For instance, the main theme was gender at the 5th Conference of States Parties to Riots Trade Treaty in 2019. And in this report published at that time by an NGO campaign called Control Arms, which claimed to be quite global and diverse, you see photos of both men and women, but almost only white women and men. And as you see in this slide, and where photos of people of color are actually used in this report, most of them are portrayed as faceless. And a few years back, actually, when many NGOs from the global south, including our colleagues from Africa, pointed out issues of discrimination, abuse of power, and a lack of accountability in this kind of group. They were labeled as violent, impolite, undiplomatic, money-seeking troublemakers, and some of them were even threatened with legal action. And I've seen such a moments time again in this sector since 2003, for nearly 20 years. Despite this, there's been a general silence on race-related matters among those in power in the humanitarian disarmament sector compared to the wider humanitarian development industry, even after the Black Lives Matter movement of last year. And also, there may be certain particular difficulties for humanitarian disarmament actors from the global south to speak openly about race-related problems of this sector. So, as someone in between, I have been making a small initiative to promote dialogue on this matter. Well, I worked for Oxfam as a humanitarian policy officer between 2003 and 2015. And our Tokyo office was actually set up in great part because Oxfam wanted to empower the Japanese civil society so as to enable the Japanese to conduct advocacy and campaigning, and thereby to change Japanese government policies and to sensitize, or in more straightforwardly racist words, enlighten the Japanese public on development and humanitarian issues. My 12 years at the office was almost all about how we could do what we thought we should do in our society while satisfying the often irrelevant needs and demands of those who are English-speaking Oxfam staff based in Oxford, New York, etc., who had almost no knowledge about our history, society, or politics. And I was made to use a different name, Midori Natsuki, whom I worked for the entire 12 years at Oxfam. I started my PhD study when I started to work at Oxfam, and those Oxfam people feared that the Japanese public might mix up my academic works and Oxfam works, and it might cause great risks to Oxfam, their brand and their image. So I couldn't call myself by my own name for my work for 12 years. And our Tokyo office, we have very little influence in the decision-making of policies and directions of the overall Oxfam Confederation. And we were involved in a humanitarian disarmament campaign called Control Arms. And we were not included in the decision-making subcommittee Control Arms composed mainly of the Western white members. But yet, we couldn't join the circle of our colleagues from the global south. And I personally clearly took sides with my colleagues from the global south when they tried to call out racism in this sector. But while our colleagues from the global south complain about tokenism that they experience daily, we Japanese do not even get tokenism. So it's like things move on as if we didn't exist at all in this sector. So, but at the same time, Japan is a big aid donor country, and surely there is a huge power gap between us and aid recipient countries and communities. So as someone in between, and as someone who is now based at a university in Japan, and who is supposed to have so-called academic liberty, and who does not need to try to receive funds from Western organizations, well, I've been trying to promote dialogue about racism and Western-centric tendencies of our humanitarian disarmament sector, holding events such as this one and this one. This is actually from last week. But I do face challenges. And one of them is that it's difficult to find speakers and potential article chapter writers of this kind of academic initiative. And there is, as you know, there's general silence among those in power, and many practitioners from the global south seem afraid of speaking up. And it's also extremely difficult for me to get to know scholars from the global south who have critically examined humanitarian disarmament sectors, discourses, practices, and structures. So our friends today, if you are in fact one of the potential speakers and our writers on this matter, or if you know of anybody else, please do let me know. And yeah, please get in touch with my humor colleagues if you're interested, and I'm sure they will link you up with me. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for the wonderful presentation, Tamara. And I think we would leave the questions for the audience. Please keep your questions and let our speakers finish their presentations first before. So now, Euclides, please take on the podium.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to follow to Tamara's presentation. I'll start by saying a little bit about the work that we do, and then I will speak to the questions that you proposed for the discussion today. I am based in Maputo. I am the director and founding member of Kaleidoscopio, which is an independent research institute based in Maputo, Mozambique. And we work on the field of social science and humanities. And we conduct basic research, but we also use the results of our research to animate public debate by organizing events that include not only academic experts, but also practitioners and artists. We also conduct consultancy research for private organizations, but also for NGOs and humanitarian organizations. Some of the reflections that I'm going to share today result from this last part of our work. Today, I would like to mention the challenges of doing research in the context of humanitarian crisis. Often responses to humanitarian crisis require interventions from outside. That's particularly the case in the African continent, where countries and governments are under resources and in many cases not prepared to quickly respond to humanitarian crisis. My interest today is to look at the dynamics between researchers and the work of research between African-based researchers and external researchers that produce knowledge to contribute to address the humanitarian crisis. In that relationship, my main focus will be on the challenges that are faced by African-based researchers, often in the countries where the humanitarian crisis happen. In order to do that, I will focus on two elements. One is remoteness, and the second is representation. So I would like to start by speaking about remoteness and expertise. The first ethical challenge that comes in a situation of humanitarian crisis is what knowledge is available to help the institutions that wish to intervene in support of groups in need can be used. Often, humanitarian crises are opportunities to produce new knowledge, but given the urgency that the crisis situation presents, the available knowledge often is produced by researchers based in the continent. With the experience from recent crisis, humanitarian crisis in Mozambique, what we have witnessed is that often locally produced knowledge is bypassed when knowledge is sought after to support humanitarian interventions. And the reason for that is that new approaches might have been developed from experiences elsewhere. And these are the approaches that are more aligned with the models and types of interventions that are conceived. So as a result of that, there is a bypass of local capacity, local research capacity, but there is also a bypass to local research institutions. Often, local research institutions and local researchers are able to participate as the field end of the kind of remote knowledge production system that is produced. In that case, we have seen the recurrent reproduction of an old model in which African-based researchers and institutions participate in knowledge production exercise as local assistants. But in the recent humanitarian crisis, we have seen with the development of new technologies that the victims themselves, those who suffer or are in the situation of need, invited to participate in the production of data. And this is done by using devices and apps that allow those in need to collect the data themselves. This poses a number of challenges to both local researchers who work as assistants and members of communities who contribute with data for these knowledge assignments. And the reason being that there is a level of risk that is produced by the humanitarian crisis in case. And those who move around to collect data to support these knowledge production exercises have to face all the risks that the so mentioned humanitarian crisis has produced. In the case of Mozambique, in the past 3 years, we have witnessed a combination in some areas of cyclones, the COVID pandemic, and political violence. I would like to turn now to my last point, which is related to the question of representation and data. This is also an old issue, but one of the issues that emerged as a challenge for local-based researcher is what is done, what do we do with the data that we collect? Often in humanitarian interventions, data collection is thought in a way that captures the situation of crisis. And often in the process of capturing the situation of crisis, we are not always aware of the implications at the level of protection of human rights and dignity of subjects that are represented in our knowledge production exercise reports, especially when we make use of images. The second and last point has to do with the storage and uses of data. At the moment of the peak of humanitarian crisis, various institutions collect and store data in order to guide their interventions. However, we have not started a discussion of what do we do with the data that we collect in the process of preparing humanitarian intervention after the intervention or the crisis situation has passed. And those are the key issues that I wanted to put forward as a way of starting up our discussion today. And thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Cletus, for the perspective from Mozambique, and very, very wonderful perspective and interesting discourses there. Once again, I want to remind our audience, please keep your questions. They will all be answered when we go through our panelists today. So Shalach, if Shalach is ready, Shalach, please go on with your submission. Thank you.
Well, it's good evening from here. So thank you for having me on this panel. I will talk about my work from a South African perspective. I provide advice to philanthropy in South Africa, to nonprofit organizations, and to universities on their financial sustainability. When I was asked to do this, I asked myself, when was the first time that I ever sort of really started thinking a lot about humanitarianism? And it took me back to 1992 when I visited Ethiopia and Eritrea. And in Addis Ababa, I met with someone from one of the aid agencies. I'm not sure which one it is, I can't recall. But the discussion was really about a kind of humanitarian crisis rhythm that was going on in the Horn of Africa. So you would have a war and humanitarian support was required. People could then, after that had been sort of dealt with, there would be a couple of years of developmental activity, and then there would be a famine. And then you would have deal with that, and then you would have a couple of years where there would be a bit of developmental stuff, and then a war would break out again. And I'm looking at Ethiopia now, and I'm thinking nothing much has changed in, what is it, 30 or 40 years. So that was the first time I really thought about the difference between humanitarian activity and developmental activity. And I know this is long time ago thinking, but I'm sitting in a South African situation, and we have been incredibly lucky in that we've had, compared to what I saw in Ethiopia then, a very quiet period since 1994, where we have really put all our energy into developmental issues, systemic issues, and in many ways we just took this for granted until COVID-19 arrived last year, and then we had the most terrible expression of, I can't explain it, social rage, where we landed up with two provinces in particular whose business sector infrastructure was absolutely devastated to the tune of billions of rands, and people out of work, small businesses were destroyed. And this didn't only happen in the main cities, but it happened right throughout those provinces in some of the smallest towns, where even if there was just one shop standing in a village, it was burnt down. So suddenly we were faced with unbelievable levels of humanitarian need in the country. Access to food, once there was a shutdown, people lost their jobs, people couldn't access food. And in the riots, which we call the winter riots in July this year, the same thing happened. So we didn't have international aid agencies flood into the country. We had to make our own. So in South Africa, a entity called the Solidarity Fund was established, and people poured money into it, whether it was private businesses, private individuals, philanthropic organizations poured money into this fund to make sure that we could supply all the medical stuff that was needed to deal with COVID, and subsequently to assist small businesses and food suppliers in the wake of these July 2021 riots. And it was interesting for me as someone working in the space, how different grant makers coped with this massive humanitarian crisis. And it certainly was the first for a very long time in South Africa. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about it, because we tend to just see humanitarianism as a sort of big catch-all for different kinds of grants and interventions and donations and things. But I think I'd like to sort of separate them out, because when it comes to what drives them, they are not the same. So yes, these are all grant makers of some sort. But what we saw with the Solidarity Fund was a lot of private money. South Africa's wealthiest were putting in R1 billion, which is a huge amount of money from one person or one family. They were at an amount that none of us had ever expected, and I don't know if they'll ever see again. But we have to ask ourselves, what drives individuals to do it? Is it altruistic? And in many respects it is. They're not asking for anything back. I don't know what conditions were put in place, but certainly that money moved out as fast as possible. And that was one of the reasons for setting up the Solidarity Fund, was that it didn't have to get trapped in all the sort of tender processes that our government has caught itself in. So you could actually move fast, and fast decisions could be made, because that was what required at the time. So we have individual giving, which is generally money. We have a lot of local philanthropic foundations. It's something quite unique on the continent, I think. Some of these go back to the 1930s and some are very new. But what we have are families and individuals establishing private philanthropic foundations, and they reacted very quickly. It's one interesting thing to say about the foundations here, because they can't avoid the issues. Whoever is running them is staring poverty in the face every day. We may not live in the same neighborhoods where very poor people live, but we see them on every street corner. We see them when we drive on the roads, where we see homeless people. So there's an awareness of inequality and poverty that is, I think, something quite different when it comes to local philanthropic foundations, and they move very fast. They changed their grant making. Their partners were suddenly given general funding rather than program funding. The contracts changed. People drew down from the endowments extra money that went into this big effort. The international philanthropic foundations in South Africa, and I still have a query whether they are philanthropic, especially the very big old ones that are run by administrations and bureaucrats. They are grant makers, and the decisions about where the money goes aren't made locally. They're made at their head offices in terms of their strategies. And I think we need to be conscious of this. Call it philanthropy still. I'd like to call it something else. We have a lot of corporate social investment in South Africa. There's a long history to it. Going back to the 1970s, it's probably one of the countries with the most sophisticated systems of corporate social investment. And again, we saw the whole corporate sector coming to the party in this crisis, particularly around supporting small businesses and people in their own sector. And I have a critique of corporate social investment. I don't think it's altruistic. I think it's all about building social capital for your company, realizing that companies are not an island in our social setting, that they need to build their reputations. They want the marketing that goes with it. But in this case, I think a lot of that was put aside and money again came into this particular situation. And then we'll look at the international aid agencies. I don't know if any of them played a role, but I do always mention to the organizations that I work with, if you are taking foreign money, you need to be aware that this is not altruistic money. It is in line with that country's foreign policy objectives. And don't kid yourself about anything else. Sometimes there is alignment, that's not a problem. But you have to ask yourself around values and what you want to achieve and what partnerships you want to make. So I think when one goes into partnership with international aid agencies or international government money, one has to go in with your eyes open. So those are the first very quick things. The other things I just want to talk about, because I do work with some international entities, and I just want to pick up on something Tamara said about how Africans are viewed. And I've always had this horror about how many aid agencies market, because it's always that flies and eyes picture. And it gives people a completely skewed view of this continent. And, for me, it's a kind of subliminal, or maybe not so subliminal, form of racism that sees Africans or people in the so-called third world in a kind of degrading and undignified way. The other thing I have experienced, I've been asked to speak to organizations who have boards, let's say, set up in New York. You get somebody who comes to Africa and feels, they come on a holiday or something, and they come back and want to do something. And they'll set up an organization that will, I don't know, run orphanages or something like that. And they will raise pots of money from their friends and relatives in New York, let's say. And they'll come out to Africa, and everybody will say what a wonderful job they're doing. And they genuinely are doing a good job. They are altruistic. They are well-meaning. But the sweet little puppy becomes a smelly dog in due course. And 10 years later, what I found was that people were coming and asking me, I'm getting tired of raising money here, and can't we raise money in country? And I'll explain to them, if you're going to do that, you have to set up the organization, not based in New York anymore, but based in the country where you have set up your NGO. And you'll have to have a local board, and you'll have to have local staff. You can't keep bringing expats out to run the show. And there's always resistance. And the argument is, we'll never find anyone who can do the job. And again, I have nothing more to say to them, because it's this absolute inability to trust Africa. And so I just want to talk about it from the perspective of the work that I've done and what I've seen. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Shalaf, for the wonderful input from South African local philanthropies. And I remember when we started this and we were deliberating on this ethical humanitarianism series, there was a very interesting question about, so does the money and the small amounts that we send, people send to support their relatives and all that, and when there's a crisis in country, how is that recorded in humanitarian supports and the definition of even humanitarian work as well? So it seems to have been fashioned for only a group. And this is what has also been transpired in all the other speakers and their presentations as well. And I'm looking forward that we'll get some time to go deeper into it. Onela, are you there? So it's your
yes,
turn
I
now.
am
Ready for you. Thank you.
Yes, I am. Let me turn on my video. Okay. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes,
Great.
we can hear you.
Okay. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I was supposed to be part of this a few months ago already, and several challenges happened in the meantime. So I'm very glad this can happen eventually. So as Divine mentioned during the introductions, I am speaking from my current standpoint as a researcher with the ISS, the Institute for Security Studies, based in Bamako, Mali, and covering the Sahel region, including, well, Central Sahel countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, as well as from my standpoint as a research program head, which means, dealing with funding and management and other issues. This, I think, is important to know in order to understand a little bit where I come from with the remarks I'm going to be making. But beyond that, and beyond my current ISS position, I think I'm also coming to this conversation as someone who carries a recent past as a humanitarian worker in the Sahel region. So before joining ISS, I had the pleasure of leading the humanitarian program of the Danish Refugee Council, DRC, in Mali for a year, and of the Danish Demanding Group in the Sahel for a year and a half. And perhaps this would be my very first observation, that maybe we just don't get enough of this type of cross-sectoral mobility, which means that we actually have individuals who carry practical knowledge from the humanitarian field into other sectors, other aspects, into research, for instance. Not to dwell on that, I'd like to pick it from where Shalak just left it, the various expressions of sector-wide racism, because I do think that if we're going to be talking about ethical humanitarianisms, that is definitely, and it was mentioned already, one big elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. I wouldn't so much take it from the now traditional or typical starting point of, Black Lives Matters and so on, because as much as those movements are extremely important, they're very culturally and historically and geographically located also in something that's very different from African realities. So talking from an African perspective, here are some of the manifestations of this racism. I have had the opportunity to witness in the humanitarian sector. Things, it goes from individual to collective and institutional and sector-wide level. At the individual level, it's, these things about recruitments. Oh, we're never going to find someone who can do this. That's interesting. that says something about what we think of education systems, of course, and that's the way it's usually waived. Oh, it's not the people, it's the educational system. But again, we have people from all nationalities and ethnicities that have attended all kinds of educational systems. There is something related to trust in the way we build partnerships. A typical example of this would be when you have those, so some very well-intentioned donors will insist on having international NGOs partner with local NGOs before they fund them. And what the international NGO will do is go and look for a local NGO that can take some of the field-based risk and transfer risk to them. For some of the area that's very difficult, or provide some kind of secondary tasks and build up a financial scheme that means that the owners of the contracts are still the big Europe or North America-based NGO. And here, the kind of argument you will hear behind the doors is exactly that. Yes, but there's so much corruption in this country, we can't really trust that this money is going to be used the right way. I think my point here is, well, if we are not honest enough to acknowledge and put these issues on the table and try to find actual solutions to them, then maybe it's just more honest to not go into partnerships than to go into partnerships with these unspoken underlying issues of trust that, again, build back into a series of governance realities, yes, but also a series of stereotypes. So getting back to the initial question, and I'm sorry if I digressed a little bit, but I thought it was important to make these couple of points. So getting back really to the initial question of how we conceptualize and understand ethical humanitarianisms, at least what I would make of it based on my multifunctional experience is that there are a few things that need to come into the picture, into the conversation. One is we need to have an honest conversation about exactly what I just mentioned about ethnicity and other forms of asymmetries in international development work in particular, and in humanitarian work specifically. Among things, this means taking a hard inward look it is very difficult to get humanitarian workers to acknowledge the ways in which they can be a part of the problem, because there is this moral licensing. We are the good people. We are sacrificing a lot to be here and to help. This is something that needs to be acknowledged and that needs to be dealt with. A second element, I think, is tokenism, which is often used as a way to shake off some of these challenges. So someone was mentioning earlier how difficult it is for so-called global South professionals in the sector to speak up to about the realities they face. But even when they do, one of the types of responses they are often faced with is a tokenistic one. Oh, we're not racist. We have one country director in this place that happens to be Black. Great. So this is something that organizations need to acknowledge as well, and need to just have a much more honest, at least internal, conversation about. And this means having in key leadership positions people from a variety of backgrounds, in terms of experience, in terms of values and where they stand, and a common commitment to equality and to honesty, really. A third element, I think, is what I would call, well, citing Edward Said, l'orientalisme, Orientalism, or the overly simplified narratives of local context. And behind that is the issue of, you know, those traveling models. We have done this thing in the Central African Republic. It worked. We're going to do the same in Mali, and then in Côte d'Ivoire. And then why not in Panama? Why not? And so on and so forth. So this way of standardizing language, approach, and instruments in the way we work, although it has its own institutional rationale behind it in terms of, you know, efficiency, optimization, and so on, ends up belittling the specificity and the richness and the complexity of the particular context we're dealing with. And this creates a situation in which we're essentially trying to, at some point after a number of those travels of the model, where we are essentially trying to fit squares into rounds, and it just doesn't work. So that's another important element I think to have in mind. Now, how humanitarian work affects the context in which it operates is also a big one, I think. Here, the obvious, you know, the obvious thing is the conflict sensitivity of the work that we do. And this requires, one of my predecessors, I think it was Euclides who mentioned it, this requires analysis and knowledge in local contextual knowledge. Oftentimes, based on my experience, I would say that oftentimes organizations on the ground have people who hold this knowledge. They just won't listen to them. They just don't listen to them because of power structures, because of who is at the top, and the fact that the actual contextual knowledge tends to lay at the bottom. This is a missed opportunity that could be corrected so easily. the second element here, when we talk about the way humanitarian work affects the context in which it operates, would be the political economy of humanitarianisms and humanitarian interventions in general. Shelagh was just mentioning several ways in which this plays out. I think one I would add is, when you have a massive humanitarian crisis unfolding and this rush of international support into a country, one of the things it does is that it creates jobs. It creates a lot of local jobs as well as international jobs. Even if the local jobs are mainly not leadership or management jobs, they are still generally, at least in the context where I work, vastly better paid than local jobs, that non-NGO related jobs, which means that effectively, while you are advancing the narrative of wanting to support the rebuild of a state, of a nation, and local capacities and so on, effectively what you're doing is taking away, draining out the little capacity that there was already there in order to bring it into your own organization. I don't have the magic solution for this. I think this is something that organizations need to be aware of. I think there could be options such as, instead of just rushing in with such big infrastructures, sometimes taking it a bit more slowly and trying to build from where exists right there and right then. But that's a quite long conversation. I will wrap up because I think my time is almost up. Essentially, I think one of the key points I would like to make is really, the need to listen to the story that the data, that political economy, that analysts, including and especially local analysts, tell us about power balances, imbalances, and essentially about asymmetries and the various ways in which they're built into the system we work with. How willing we are to indeed listen to what the data is telling, especially when that challenges our own fundamental assumptions about how necessary the work we do is and how great people we are for choosing this career and not being bankers, is, I think, something that can go quite a long way in bringing back an ethical perspective into the work that we do. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Honela. It's really it's really nice to hear you mention all these different but yet very important aspects of this discussion, and linking it also to the previous speakers and what they have mentioned. I can see we will have a lot to talk about this evening, but we'll go on to take the last two. So Emmanuel, is Emmanuel there now? Emmanuel, if you're there, please take on the mantle. Emmanuel?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I have
Yes.
issues with my video. So I hope the participants will forgive me for not showing up my face. I'm just going to go very quickly on this topic, and I totally agree with what has been submitted by the other panelists. Let me start by saying that I work with the African Development Bank, leading educational skills development programs and initiatives in Africa, with a focus on technical and vocational education and training, higher education research, and innovation. Now, when you look at ethical humanitarianism, I start by noting that this requires that we remain impartial in whatever we do, remain independent and focused on preventing human suffering, and of course, putting across strategies and policies that address the challenges that humans face, so that we can promote sort of improved welfare of people. In many setups, I would say that ethical humanitarianism is not easy to live up to, given, of course, the principles that ground this humanitarianism, And also, given that different people look at these principles differently, I would say then that such requires, I mean, if we are to live up to it, it requires that whatever you do, it must be sort of foundationed or grounded on a strong moral authority or moral foundation. Looking at the work experience, my own work experience, or I mean on this subject, my experience in humanitarianism on the projects and programs that we undertake at the African Development Bank, particularly on the area of human capital development, of course, shows that a lot needs to be done around this subject. I would say that our core focus, just for your information, is the strengthening of higher education systems through teacher training, curriculum development, policy frameworks in education, and skills development, the development of innovative financing schemes for education to bridge the existing financing gaps in the sector, the production and management of knowledge, as well as dissemination of the same knowledge, promotion of partnerships, particularly between education institutions, government and the private sector, and sort of the incorporation of digital skilling and methodologies in higher education, especially given the systemic weaknesses that have been exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when you look at all this, we face serious sort of challenges in ensuring that we live up to ethical humanitarianism, both as an institution and between the African Development Bank and our beneficiaries. Often you find that the balance in terms of gender sort of interventions remain a major challenge in our activities, in our programs, again, both inside our institution and as well as between, our institution and the entities that we work with, particularly governments and the private sector. One challenge being that reaching out to fragile states or those countries that are faced by conflicts and wars and, marginalized population and people with special needs, somehow such are often inadvertently discriminated. It is not that this discrimination comes out knowingly, but it just happens that when we put our interventions in place, you realize that the balance that we expect to see as a bank is not what happens at the end. And therefore, the impact and the outreach that is part of our agenda is not usually met. And therefore, because of these challenges, the African Development Bank has come up with various strategies to address this and to ensure that we balance. We ensure that there's a balance in our interventions and in investments. And these strategies include the human capital development strategy. We do have the gender strategy, fragile states strategy, and when you look at them, it is basically addressing challenges within a specific ecosystem. When you look at the human capital strategy, the key cross-cutting issues, one of them is gender, and we always advocate for 50-50 male-female interventions. We also look at ensuring that we bring up those living in marginalized areas. We also sort of put more efforts or emphasis on ensuring that we invest more in the fragile states, and the principles that we put in our investments in such states are not the same as other member countries. And this ensures, again, that our outreach and our impact of the activities that we undertake as a bank address or uplift those at the base or those at the bottom, so the ones that have been left behind because of the challenges that we face. But as I said, this ethical humanitarianism is certainly a huge challenge in our activities, and something that we that I would say is a work in progress to ensure that we meet the needs of the population that we work in, but also to meet the bank's agenda on socio-economic transformation of the continent. Therefore, such strategies are set to help meet the bank's agenda, as I put it, but also to help improve the quality of the lives of people in Africa. Now, some of the key questions that I would look at, from my own perspective and from the perspective of the bank include: one, how do we ensure, as an institution, that ethical humanitarianism is incorporated in our development interventions, our development agenda, for the continent? Because then if this is sort of embedded in everything that we do, then we would expect to live up to the principles that underline ethical humanitarianism. Number two, as an organization, how can we address humanitarianism challenges so that we can increase our impact as an organization, but also the outreach? Because to us, the quality of our interventions and the quantity or the numbers of people that we reach up to is very critical. And given where Africa is in terms of development, looking at these two components is critical, not just to meet our agenda, but also to meet other global frameworks or agenda, including the UN's SDGs, as well as the AU's Agenda 2063. Then lastly, and I think this is also a very critical question, is how can all stakeholders be involved in addressing this topic in our organizations? Because then often we find that we tend to work in isolation. We tend to look as a bank that it is us who should ensure that everything that we do conforms to ethical humanitarianism. However, this should not just come from the bank, but also from our partners, our beneficiaries, our member countries, other organizations that we work with, and all stakeholders in this sphere. And then finally, looking at the new ideas or notions of personhood, I would start by emphasizing that equity and equality, which entails treating people the same way, regardless of who they are or regardless of their individual difference, is very important if we are to promote ethical humanitarianism in our organizations. And this equity and equality is a subject that has been discussed over and over. A subject that has been incorporated in our policies and frameworks and the strategies and our plans. But somehow we do not live up to it, given the kind of outcomes, inputs that we see in the projects and initiatives that we run. And number two is the human dignity. Looking at that and noting that human beings possess a special value intrinsic to their humanity, and as such are worth of respect, not just because we live in Africa, but because they are human beings, regardless of their age, regardless of their status, gender, tribe, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. All this means that we all need to treat each and every one of us with utmost respect. And the next one is freedom for all. And this, of course, includes freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and any other freedom. And you see, in most of our countries here in the continent, that such freedom, is not exercised or is not, given to all. It is not accessible or available to all of us. In some cases, you find that journalistic interventions are ganged by our governments, or even movement in some parts of our countries, are restricted. And as such, we should deliberately work towards non-discrimination of our people in everything that we do. And I would say that this is something that the bank advocates to ensure that our investments and interventions are not just for a select view, but you know, we have that. We ensure that we target everyone, every other person in the continent. Because when you talk about improving the quality of our people, of all the people in the continent, it means that this kind of improvement of our welfare should be for everyone and everybody in the region. And finally, you know, you need to look at love for humanity. I mean, you know, if you are to think of ethical humanitarianism, then love comes into focus. Because if then we ensure that there's love amongst ourselves or between one person to the other, then the humanitarianism that you're talking about will automatically come into play. So to me, looking at love, of course, plus respect is critical, I mean, in implementing the principles that underline ethical humanitarianism. And as I conclude, I would want to emphasize that the organizations that we work for, you know, in both international organizations, of course, and national institutions, NGOs, and CSOs, I mean, we should ensure that they work towards promoting the principles that are the foundation of ethical humanitarianism, so that this can aid people who are suffering, support victims of armed conflicts. Those people are facing serious challenges like famines, and also people who are sort of facing natural disasters, people in fragile states, and so on and so forth. So organizations should be at the forefront in ensuring that we promote these principles for the welfare of our people. Finally, continued efforts, and I think I did mention this, from all stakeholders are needed to address some or most or all of the ethical humanitarianism challenges, so that we can maximize the effectiveness of the engagement in areas that face challenges or problems, both crises, you know, the disasters that we've talked about, but also those ones in fragile states in the continent. This maximization of the effectiveness of this engagement will ensure that the quality of life living, or the improvement of social welfare that I alluded to, you know, would get to as many people as possible. Because of time, I think I'll end at that. And thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. And you've given us a lot of perspectives to look at in terms of national and international organization and the organizations we work for and with. Thank you very much. And I will take the last speaker. And then I'll urge everyone to prepare their questions. You can already start, if you have some questions, you can already put on the chat. The chat is open, and then make your questions ready. And please, if you ask a question to a particular speaker, make it clear and let the speaker know, or let us know who you are addressing your questions to. So, Lisa, thank you so much. It's up to you now.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to this seminar, this series, and it's very interesting. And I must confess, also to me, not a new, in a sense, a new topic. And I'll try to address it to the best of my ability and see how you find that in the end. I'm thinking, firstly, that this actually concerns two different, partly different areas. I mean, it's ethical humanitarianism. It's both an issue for a general aspect of philanthropy or aid, since since you're referring to the basic idea of kindness and vis-a-vis other drivers for giving away your money or giving in order to improve conditions or for other people, which is sort of the basis for that. And that's, of course, a driver to some degree, at least, for all kinds of aid and philanthropy and charity, if you like, whatever the end use of that funding, but then or that money. And then it's also the question of humanitarian aid, that is more of the emergency kind, how you try to rescue or run to the needs of people in immediate dire distress, and what you can do about that. And we have I've heard both these things today being touched or alluded to in various very interesting and thought-provoking interventions. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking of, where are we in this area? Another thing that is also sort of part of my conceptualization of this concept is the power relations that several before me now have alluded to. Power relations created by and the imbalance of power between those who have and those who have not, be it financial means, or be it knowledge, or be it some sort of societal status in society, etc. And I think this could both happen within a specific context, or within a society, as well as in this international interactions, where obviously there is a division between rich countries and poor countries, or richer on low income and high income countries, etc., where the financial means come from. But I mean, it's very obvious also in a knowledge society that it's that you have a strength, or you are the stronger part if you have knowledge in a situation of how to solve that. And then of course you get into different types of knowledge and how you should value that. That's a whole other discussion. But in this power relations, I mean, some of the things that Ornella was addressing vividly is very true. The aid industry has a lot of flaws, and we recognize this ignorance of local context, distrust of local partners, the draining of local capacity into the international organizations, and also the elements of racism or prejudice against certain people. And all those things are difficult and discouraging also, of course, because the best kind of cooperation happens if you are in a situation where you give and take, you learn from each other, and you can cooperate in that sense. So those are some of the reflections, and then that just pops into my head when I hear these presentations, and then I'm thinking about how this fits with what we do at SIDA, which is SIDA is a public aid agency in Sweden, and we give away lots of money from our Swedish taxpayers. So in that sense, it's a philanthropy in an organized, national, state-organized philanthropy, in a sense, or charity, or whatever you want to call it. And we are, of course, trying to be very kind, because we don't want to say that we do this for our own benefit and to serve our own interests. But of course we do, in a sense. And at times you can think of it as, I mean, you can either think of it as paving the way for instance, Swedish business interests, that you give aid with one hand and then you can take back benefits from investment opportunities. Then it gets a little more problematic as a motive. On the other hand, you can always then also say that these business relationships and these investments that potentially Swedish private interests could make in a certain context or a country is actually beneficial to also to that particular partner country where you're investing. So that's, even that is a complicated statement to say that this is just out of self-interest, and thus it would be sort of morally despicable in some sense. But I didn't mean to talk a lot about private sector investments, actually, although that is part of where things are landing in this context. I meant to think about what we do, where I come from this research support unit at SIDA, because of our some 27 billion Swedish kronor, 1 billion goes to research support. And all the rest goes to various other things that we do in various other countries, not least humanitarian aid, which is some 5 billion of these 27 billion Swedish kronor at SIDA, just to give you the sort of the framework. But 1 billion Swedish kronor is for research support. And I'd like just to talk a little bit about that, because it is also some kind of response to these issues that have been raised. What we believe is that it's important, that knowledge is important. It's important to know more and to advance the scientific base for how we understand the world, if you want to be grand in that. And if that's important, and if you think that a positive development, a benefit people's welfare is a good thing, then you want to support research. And what kind of research? Well, we give a lot of money to various research organizations that investigates various issues, both within health or within natural sciences, environmental issues, but also social sciences and the humanities. So it's a broad range of areas which we support. And we do that for the benefit of the framework for that is that it should have some relevance in a development context, but it's quite wide. And another thing that we do is that we support research capacity development. And the idea there is that local research capacity is very important for every country, every context, in order to be able to be in charge of its own development process. Each country and each region should have the capacity to both consume knowledge, in the sense that you read and you understand what it's saying, etc., and also to produce knowledge. And you have several have addressed this, the importance of local knowledge. Thinking in particular about Euclides' intervention, which was addressing precisely this, and the power imbalance often in international research relations, where local research is exploited for the benefit of the northern researchers, curriculum vitae, if you would like. But so our contribution is to try to emphasize the importance of locally produced research, local research training, local capacity at the national universities in partner countries, and also that researchers also from every country should have access to international research funding in order to be able to set the research agenda, decide on what to study and how to study it, and take ownership of that approach. And that's sort of one attempt to contribute to a better balance in the knowledge community. Should also add that a third thing that we do in general terms is to try to promote the usage of knowledge, of research, its application, but also the spreading of research findings through research communication. We do this in practice. We do this through various programs and organizations that are specialized in this area. I think also one issue that we are trying to understand better at this point connects these two different areas for humanitarianism that I mentioned in the beginning, both the aid business at large, the whole concept of giving away money, and the specifics of humanitarian aid and emergency situations. Since we are trying to understand in what way, how, and if we can also contribute to research capacity development in conflict situations, or in countries that are burdened by conflicts and fragility, and in what ways then we could do that better. And I should finalize, I think, my intervention at this point with just saying that all this, what we're doing, it's based on a strategy given to us by the Swedish government. So that's the structure in Sweden. The government decides what we should do, and then we try to work out and learn and elaborate how we should do what the government wants us to do. When the government wants us to support research for these three different objectives: build capacity, support development relevant research, and promote the usage of research. So I think I'll end there at this point, and then maybe come back later. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Now we've heard from Lisa as well, and so the floor is open. Thank you, Lisa, so much for giving us a very broad perspective from your organization, and how from which perspective these funding schemes have to be dispersed, and the strategies behind it, and also how you connected with especially with Euclid's mentioning of local knowledge production and the power imbalances and the exploitation of local knowledge as well. So this goes hand in hand with also what other presenters have already mentioned. Now the floor is open. I think I would keep my own questions in order to allow others to ask. Divine, you have a lot of questions here. I can see your questions are swimming quite a lot. And I will come back to your question, but let's see if there is anyone in the partner, in the audience who has a question. If you have a question, you can quickly raise your hand. We have roughly 20 minutes to take questions. You can raise your hand, or you can write it like Divine did, and then we take it. If not, let me start with Divine's questions. So Divine is asking, I think for all the panelists, you can also see from the chat, they are addressed to each and every one of you. So let's take like 1 minute to try to tackle the question from Divine to each of you. Let's start with Tamara. So Tamara, Divine is asking, in the midst of our predicament, should we be taking assistance from organizations with unethical practices like the ones you have described, or should accepting money have a moral barometer or standard? Can an unethical organization do ethical work? This is a question for you, Tamara.
Thank you, Divine. In my opinion, it's basically no. Unethical organizations cannot do ethical works. But in very rare minor cases, when some like-minded staff, those internal of the organizations, take care of their internal problems and try to suppress exploitative acts or attitudes internally of their own staff, the money may contribute to something better, but it's a very minor, rare phenomenon. So I basically say we, basically cannot expect much from that sort of organizations that I have shown in my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's a very straight and direct answer to the question. Light and darkness usually cannot work together, right? That's where. Thank you very much, Tamara, for that. I can see Minga here. Minga, please unmute yourself. You can also turn on your camera if you're okay with that, and then please ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much, Kweku. And thank you to the panelists. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Each person spoke about their different organization and what they do. I've taken note while you were speaking, and I think it can be in a form of a question, or it can be in a form of trying to understand some of the key words that were put in this presentation. And I think there are two words that Lisa spoke about, say that, ethic and human, these are the two words that we should deal with. And I think Emmanuel responded to that, saying that, it's difficult. Ethical humanitarian is it's not easy to live up to. Now, I'm just going to give a current example that we are having today, which is the COVID pandemic, whereby the president of Ghana spoke at the UN saying that Africa does not need help. Africa wants to buy the vaccines. And I think for some of us are aware of what happened recently when the current virus has been not discovered in South Africa, was spoken from the South African perspective that, we found Omicron virus in South Africa. Out of the blue, all the southern country were banned because of, we know what happened. Now, the question that the president asked then was that, Africa want to buy the vaccines, but we do have agencies that says, no, we want to donate. And I think this ties with also Divane's questions to say that, do we really need to go through that path? When we have some African countries that say, we want to buy, but you still come and say we want to donate. Even when you want to donate, Botswana discovered that virus before, which is something that the president of South Africa spoke about, I think today or yesterday, saying that just because we spoke about the virus, then instead of applauding us, you punish us. Now, what is your view from your experience? And I'm glad that Ornella spoke about something very interesting. You touch on racism, which is critical point in these humanitarian issues. So what is your view from what you have spoken about in the context of the pandemic, using what we call humanitarian aid? This question goes to all of you, if you may respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mingam, and thank you, Onela. You've also responded to the question Divine put on the platform. I'll ask all our audience to also be checking the chat. Some of their answers will be given there. So let's take one more question, and then as we reflect on the question from Mingam about the racial aspect of what we are experiencing now, with this even COVID pandemic at the moment. Karina, thank you for joining us. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Kweku, and thank you to all the panelists. It was a super interesting discussion. I actually have multiple questions, and I'll try to keep it short. So as a person who actually works in humanitarian aid as in advocacy towards the German government, and also having a certain kind of influence to how money is spent and what kind of money is funneled into which projects, this idea of power relations and humanitarian aid is extremely interesting to me. And I think it's quite clear that there is a power relation inherent if there is someone giving money to someone else. There is a power relation. This is something that you can't deny. Now, how do we work inside this power relation in order to make it as least harmful as possible is something that I'm always confronted with. And with this, in a more like practical reason, I think it's clear that an international organization should not be the implementing part inside a project, but this kind of implementation should be given to a local organization. This is a localization strategy, which is a new conversation, but it is a conversation being held with the German government and with the ministries. It's extremely interesting. It's a localization strategy together with the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Development. And I would like to know from the panelists, whoever is interested in answering, what do you think, what kind of boxes need to be ticked in order to have a successful localization strategy, apart from, for example, not being the direct implementing part? How would you propose that international organizations do a screening of potential local partners? How can we do that in a mostly decolonized way, maybe? And my third question would be, what do we propose that we take into the conversation with donors, ministries, donor organizations, private donors? What kind of toolbox should we have in order to convince those counterparts in a discussion and negotiation of the importance of local capacity and knowledge? I hope my points were clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. Your questions are indeed multifaceted questions, and I'm sure the panelists would take note of that. Shall we go quickly to the two questions? So Karina is asking about localization strategy and what you, the panelists, what are your views on this? If you have any input on that, and what do you think about that? And also how international organizations can do proper screening so that this issue of power relation can be reduced. And what other toolboxes are there that can be also used to improve these kind of partnerships that are there between SAL or donors and the recipient countries, and of course the issue of power relations. So if we combine that to the question from Minga, what can you say? Let's be straightforward and try to answer these questions. And after that, let's remember we have some questions from Divine also there. Yes, so anyone can start. Please go ahead. Yes, Onela. Yes.
Yes, somehow after almost 2 years of COVID, I'm still confused of where to virtually raise my hand, so I just do it physically. Anyways, so one of the questions I hear coming back through the various questions raised is around localization and how do we get this right? I think, to be very straightforward and quite concise, a key point for me would be that you cannot expect a localization agenda that's only about implementation to work. It means if you want localization to work, it needs to start from the point of project design or even identification of what the problem is. So you really need to go upstream in the process and not come up with your own understanding of what the problem is and then trying to look for someone to do the job. This will maintain a kind of transactional approach, and it will not build the kind of local ownership that we want. And I think when we talk about localization, getting serious about the whole local ownership talk is critical. And that means letting go of power. That means acknowledging that sometimes what you want to be the solution and what you think would be the right solution is not what actually people want to be. So yeah, it takes a lot, but it really requires, I think, starting the conversation much higher upstream, and not just waiting for the kind of, we have a strategy, now we want implementing partners or implementing agencies, and we will look for that.
Yeah, I think in a way you've also answered a question from Divine as well, because Divine was asking, maybe quickly you can also give a touch on that. He's asking the idea of listening to the story is critical, but how do we move from the idea to practice, especially given the way in which humanitarianism operates along a power matrix? So I think you've mentioned that, but would you want to quickly address Divine on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so. Here, again, this imbalance happens in so many ways and in such different contexts, right? So within an organization, within a given humanitarian organization, it can be something as simple as creating opportunities for just anyone to get access to leadership to talk, meaning not having, well, you will always need the kind of hierarchical reporting system that has to go up the streams, etc. But we know that a lot of information gets streamed down based on what people think matters. So, well, if someone at the top wants to know what really the knowledge that the organization holds is, they need every now and then to actually reach out to people who are quite far down the food chain from them. And it can be as simple as just, inviting colleagues in for a coffee every other week, something like that. And yeah, then if you want to take it at the level of donor / organization, it comes back to all the points that I think Lisa was raising earlier too.
Thank you very much. By the way, for coffee invitations now, some places is still not easy, but thank you for that. Thank you, Ornella, so much. Lisa's hand was up. Next, so Lisa, please take it up. Yeah, so the questions that were put by Karina and Minga, and also the one from Divine. One is addressed to you. I think two also are addressed to you.
Thank you. I was just going to connect to that issue about how to make better use of local entrepreneurs or agencies rather than putting other people on the ground, so to speak. And I'm thinking that that's of course desirable and the best for many reasons, and it's the same sort of logic as making use of local knowledge and promoting local research, etc., although in another context. And it's related also in the same kind of difficulty that we have as a Swedish aid agency, and that's of course that we are governed by our own political context, where things like mismanagement of funds is very provocative, and the least risk of being involved in anything like that far away is politically very sensitive for the aid industry as such, if I may call it that, for this sector. that is one driver behind sort of making use of established forms, although it's not actually the best for whatever problem you're going to solve. And that's a very tragic thing, because it for all these reasons. But that's a reality. And the same kind of reality, or the same kind of sort of relationship to our local context where we are at with this aid that we're doing, is about the local needs that Divine, I think, asked a question about. How can we consider divine local needs in our research priorities? And of course, that's, as I said, that's what we want to do. We want to have try to explore various ways where actually the local needs, the local research agenda is what we support. And the universities presents their own programs, or specific organizations have their own work programs that we support because it seems reasonable, but it's not us indicating that this is what it should be about. But of course, that has to be matched by lots of instructions and ambitions from a Swedish context that we should consider. And, we have lots of it. It should be a poverty perspective, a rights perspective, a gender perspective, environment and climate perspective, and a conflict perspective. That's just one set of rules for us to sort of navigate through. And that might not match what we actually what our partner is actually concerned with at the moment, or might not fit so well, although these are quite broad areas, but still. And then there is applied research vis-a-vis more basic research, and the applied research is always more easier to advocate, sort of, that seems like you're finding out about a vaccine, that's against a tropical disease, that sounds good. We'll fund it, but not sort of more basic medical research, etc. So these are difficulties also in the Swedish context that hinders us to do what would be the best, or in our.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa. Cledis, your hand, and then we come to Shalaf. So Cledis, please. You can have your take on any of the questions. Yes.
Thank you, Kwaku. I think Ornella and Lisa have already covered most for the earlier questions. Maybe I'll speak from one of the questions that was posed earlier by Divine in the chat, and it has to do with the fact that if research does help to solve humanitarian crisis. And it's interesting, at least from the perspective from which I spoke today, is that of a humanitarian crisis, which is different than that of development intervention. And I think it would be very interesting for us to think from the recent examples that we have, I guess, with COVID-19. When I mentioned the bypassing of local knowledge and local experiences, if you think of countries in Southern Africa, had already an extensive experience with HIV. And then we also had experience with transmissible diseases in countries like Mozambique, such as cholera, and non-transmissible diseases such as malaria. When COVID came, all this knowledge and expertise was just not brought to the table. Yet, a lot of the solutions that were ultimately used to address the pandemic had somehow been used in the past. So again, it's part of someone in the chat mentioned a question about the kind of knowledge regimes that humanitarian intervention produce. So humanitarian interventions often produce, they emerge and operate within a knowledge regime that often subordinates existing forms of knowledge. And another way of thinking the same question is related to another issue mentioned here, which is the issue of localization and appropriation. And there was one question which was, how do we screen for local organizations? It would be revealing if we ask, how do we screen for international organizations, for humanitarian organizations? Because then what emerges is the question of capacity.
Yeah.
And what we witness is that often a lot of the experts that arrive to help address the humanitarian crisis are really not only people who have little knowledge about the subject, they have little knowledge, little work experience at all. So really it's a question of asking the same questions from different angles. A number of these issues are already, at least in the research field, they're already known, they've been discussed, but then the ethical questions become more visible when situations of humanitarian crisis emerge, and you find that a whole program is designed by a team of researchers that is sitting far away, trying to collect data or extract information from locally based researchers without really trying to engage with the reality in any significant way. My last point has to do with one question that was mentioned of what was the use of research in terms of addressing humanitarian crisis. If in fact we were not wasting money as such, especially when people are in desperate need. I was last week doing field research in an area of humanitarian crisis, and in one of the interview groups that I sat with, I was asked about the work and the data that the colleagues that had arrived before me, what they had done with it. And the interviewee suggested that I looked at the river nearby, that I would most probably find a lot of the survey questionnaires that they had been subjected to floating around. So it's interesting, we really need to distinguish between two kinds of data collections that happen. There is one type of data collection that is done by humanitarian organizations in order for them to prepare the interventions. And obviously, that kind of exercise generates expectations from people who are in vulnerable situations. But then there is the research that also needs to be done, especially prior knowledge and ongoing research as the crisis evolves. That is also a different type of data collection and analysis that needs to be taken into consideration when we are addressing humanitarian crisis. So it calls for an awareness of our interaction with vulnerable groups and people who are in a situation of dispossession caused by the crisis. When we do these exercises of data collection, whether these are for research purposes or for intervention purposes, because in fact they generate a set of expectations associated with the kind of information that we require from them. And obviously in today's world, people are, even in situations of crisis, they are still very much, they are more connected to each other. So people are aware of what kind of interventions and supports and kits are being distributed elsewhere. So if you show up asking questions about survival kits, communication tools, they will already be expecting those kind of products because they've heard elsewhere that they had been distributed.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Euclides. Now, Sheila, we take your view on the questions, and then we will try to bring it to an end.
Okay, I'm very aware of your time, so I won't talk for too long. There was a very early question from Divine about should humanitarian organizations have come into South Africa during the violence and riots. I'm very grateful they didn't. We have our own humanitarian organization in particular called Gift of the Givers, which actually operates in 44 countries, but it's based in Africa, funded by Africa, and it delivers the most massive range of humanitarian support across the world. But in South Africa in particular, it was very, very active right through COVID, right through the violence. In fact, they are incredibly nimble and very, very fast. So we certainly don't need anyone else out there. The advantage of having our own is they buy our own produce, they employ our own staff, and they go where they are asked. So you may find them in the middle of a violent situation, but you might also find them providing boreholes for farmers where there's drought. So it's a very flexible organization that we're extremely proud of, actually. The one thing I just want to go to this local issue, because that is the huge advantage that we've had in South Africa, that it is local. But I was speaking to someone the other day about what happened in Kivu province in the Congo, where humanitarian aid was brought in when there were a lot of refugees from Rwanda, and in particular, large amounts of grain, clearly from subsidized farmers somewhere else in the world. This grain was brought in, it was distributed to people in the province who didn't really want it, and it was sold. So it was sold really cheaply because it had been received for free, and it undercut the cost of grain that was produced in Kivu. And it actually created a whole humanitarian economy and destroyed a local economy. So when we talk about local, for me, it's this research before people go in to find out what do people actually want, and secondly, is it available locally instead of bringing it across the world in ships and undercutting local economies. So I would look at who is there available locally who can do it, what is needed locally, what is available locally to support those economies and maybe even to grow them. And how is it managed locally? So previously, and I can't remember who it was, said that humanitarian agencies shouldn't actually be doing the job. And I think to get it as deeply local as possible, including sourcing the assets that our local economies have. They may not appear to be a lot, but one may be surprised what is available locally that is far more suitable for people than, let's say, a sack of imported grain.
Thank you very, very much, Eshalakdan. Yeah, okay. So now, Emmanuel, please, are you there? Do you want to have your last word for us before Emmanuel?
Yes,
yes,
I'm
please.
here. I'm just going to look at the question that came from Divine on whether, let me just get it, on whether education is humanitarian work. And I would say no, the role of education is to support, not necessarily, to support humanitarian work. It is not necessarily in humanitarian work, specifically from the point of view that we as a bank work from. So I know we are caught up by time, but we insist as a bank that humanitarianism, specifically with the word ethical, should always be part of everything that we do in our education and skills development work in the continent. Why we do this is, of course, to ensure that we meet our agenda, but also we reach out to every African in the continent to ensure, to promote their socio-economic welfare, and of course to put them at the level where we would like them to be. So on that question, Divine, I would just say that we invest in education to promote ethical humanitarianism in the continent. Over.
Thank you very, very much. Ethical humanitarianism, resetting. So we bring the discussion to an end. I'm sorry, there might be a lot of discussions or questions that were put there because of the time. We're already playing the extra time of the grand finale. So we will end it up here. Usually I like to do this. Our theme today is to reset this whole thinking of ethical humanitarianism. There is a question of what comes next after these sessions. Divine will talk a bit about that and also reshare our ideas going forward for next year. But as we reset, leave us with one statement. This is just one statement from you that we can take along. This is not to defeat everything you've said, but if you want us to leave here, enter next year, as we continue with this discussion, leave us with a key phrase, a key sentence, a key word that you want us to take on. So I will go the other way round. Emmanuel, if you are there, can you start with us? This is just for like 5 seconds. It's even enough. It's even more. Just give us what should be the final word we should take home. A sentence, a phrase, a word. It's enough.
Well, I would say stakeholder partnerships. Critical in sort of pushing the element of ethical humanitarianism on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Partnership, yes. Shalak, what will you be your last take on that?
Well, I'd like to hear more about ethical dilemmas.
We will hear more about that perhaps next year, and we'll come back again on that. Thank you very much. Ethical dilemmas, yes, that's nice. Cletus, please, your take, your last word, phrase.
I would say we need to diversify expertise and
diversify expertise. Thank you very much. You see how these words are coming up. Yes, thank you very much. Lisa, I'll come to you.
That's fortunate. Support local research ownership. So that's connected to you, please.
Local research ownership and diverse. Oh, I love this session of the show very, very much. Thank you so much. Tamara, I see you next on my list.
For me, more collaboration among like-minded organizations and individuals, because each of us are working on our own local and research chances to work with other organizations who have similar interests and ideas.
Thank you. I didn't get everything, but I heard that you're talking about supporting the communication, like-minded discussions and discourses. Am I right on that?
Yes, because I always feel I work on my own in Japan. So I want more collaboration with other organizations and individuals and researchers and who have similar interests. Yeah,
okay. Thank you very much for that input. And now, Onela, your last phrase, sentence, word that you leave us with?
That's a tough one. There's so much. I mean, I would say listen,
Listen.
You don't know what you don't know, and context matters. So if you want to know your context, you have to listen.
Thank you very, very much. And then on that note, we bring the discussion this evening to an end. Like I mentioned, this ends, or as you know, this ends the series for this year. And we have some ideas in the pipeline. That's a political word. Usually a politician says it's in the pipeline. We don't know what that pipeline is, but we have one between this series and it's gonna flow next year, and Divine will tell us more about that.
Yeah,
Please,
no,
Divine.
just to say thank you, to add to the thanks. And it's been a long year and we've brought colleagues here. Thank you for your generosity and your kindness. Don't take it for granted. And it's so much generosity, to speak both to colleagues and also to broader publics. But we are going to put together the notes for the entire year, and the idea is to organize a workshop and a seminar early next year when we would have been unbanned from these global borders, and hopefully have people to meet either here or online so that we discuss the next steps. But a question that has emerged is the question of the local, which is really important. That's something that we might need to deepen further. And there was also questions around what we should do with morality and what we should do with dignity and also ethics, which is, those are really important questions that we'll take further. But thank you so much, and thank you to Kweku for your collaboration and for the work you've done all through the year, and also to colleagues at Huma who have worked really hard all year long, to make this possible. So we will see everybody next year. Don't forget, we have other activities. We have a seminar tomorrow, the doctoral seminar, and the last one on Thursday to close the year. So thank you and have a lovely.
And thank you very much, Divine, as well, for all the hard work that you put into the series, and for everyone, all our audiences. I've seen some people that we started with have been following us even up to now. Thank you so much for the support, and we will get more from this because there's so much shared here on this platform. And of course, like Lisa mentioned, we have to make use of this information, and we'll get back on that. Thank you very much for your time. Sorry for the extra time, but there's no penalties this time. We will just move on and go get some rest. And Tamara, please, thank you so much. You are the furthest from us all. And I don't know whether you go back to bed or anything, but thank you all for your time. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Arigato.
Arigato.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Merci beaucoup.